Good morning. Greetings to everybody joining us. As a preceding point, I have been delivering presentations on this subject matter, school security, for about 10 years now. The overwhelming majority are for school leaders, faculty members, and I've even delivered a couple of presentations for high school groups and independent schools as well. But when Guidewell came to me recently and approached me about presenting to parents, it actually kind of gave me a moment of pause as I tried to decide exactly what type of topics would be relevant and would be of specific interest to parental audiences. So as I was kind of thinking about it, I decided to kind of focus on those questions that seem to come up quite frequently when I'm doing news media interviews and talking with others on these kinds of matters, and then maybe explore some of the questions I would have if I was a parent and I didn't do what I do for a living, working in the security profession. So today, what we'll be focusing on is a couple of key things. And at the end, I want to leave a liberal amount of time for Q&A for those things that I may not have addressed in this program. One of the first questions that we'll address today is my child's school safe? I know this is a universal question and concern for many parents. Then, related to that, what should I know as a parent? Or more importantly, what can I do as a parent as it relates to my child's safety? And under this discussion, we'll also explore this issue of recognizing and reporting behavior of concern, which is very important as a parent. Also, understanding what a reunification plan is and how that may influence your response in the aftermath of any type of crisis event at your school campus. And then we'll talk maybe very briefly at the end, and I'll definitely be open to question and answer on the topic of educating our kids about awareness and response in a manner that effectively prepares them, but at the same time is also done in a way that is sensitive to their emotional well-being. Now, quite often when I'm speaking to lay audiences, people that are not engaged in the security profession or law enforcement, I realize that when this subject of active shooter violence comes up, there's a lot of different perspectives. There's people out there that think that this could never happen in their school, that would never affect them. And then we also have a lot of people these days that have been repetitively exposed to these kinds of events in the news media, and due to the high profile media coverage, can sometimes have an exaggerated fear of these kinds of events, an amplified concern, as it were, about the safety of their children when they send them off to school in the morning. And that's quite natural, because it seems these days that just about every week we hear of a new school shooting somewhere in the United States, a new horrific tragedy, reminding us frequently of the potential risk that we take every day when we drop our kids off at car line. So I'd like to first begin with that kind of topic. Now, the FBI, for a period of quite some time now, has been documenting information about active shooter attacks in the United States. On slide is kind of a breakdown based on the most recent updated analysis that they've given, looking at active shooter events going back all the way to the year 2000 up to the time period of 2018. And according to the FBI statistics, approximately 15%, just a hair over 15% of those events occurred in K-12 schools. The total number being 42 that met their definition of an active shooter attack. Now, bear in mind, as we look at this slide, this isn't necessarily also encompassing plots that were disrupted as a result of investigative activities. What the actual number of those plots are, I can't tell you. There's been some studies on this matter looking at specific events, and there's also been effort made towards creating a database of these kinds of prevented attacks, but we really don't have any authoritative statistics at the present time. Now, looking at these genuine events, things that have actually resulted in mass shootings in schools, when we massage the math, when we look at this from a statistical perspective, considering that there's 131,000 schools, K-12 schools in the United States, looking at the number of attacks over the 18-year period, that makes the odds of any one of these schools having a shooting 1 in 3,117 over this 18-year period, which would then make the probability 0.0003. Very, very low. And by the way, this isn't just a low probability when we talk about school shooting events. This is true for other types of targeted violence as well. I have similar statistics for this kind of thing when it comes to terrorist attacks, workplace violence, shootings, and other similar types of events. It is a generally an accurate statement to state that acts of mass homicide are low probability events, but with potentially high consequences, which is the reason why in risk management, we do devote so much attention towards controlling and reducing these kinds of risks. Now, for many people, when they hear this, in fact, even when I'm teaching educators and I bring these statistics up, I'll often see a lot of eyes open up in the room because that seems, counter to their own intuitive perception of what the actual risk of the school shooting is. And cognitive scientists attribute this kind of distorted perspective of the risk to a psychological function, basically a bias, as it were, called availability bias, which is the human tendency to think of examples of things that come readily to mind as more representative than is actually the case. And this affects our risk perception as a result of seeing all these different headlines persistently and news media coverage of these kinds of events, increasing our perception of the probability of these kinds of things. So just to kind of summarize, the point that I'm trying to make here, the risk to your child specifically of being in a school shooting is extraordinarily low. Now, although that is true, these are real events nevertheless. I have been in the business of managing risks of mass homicide for about 30 years now. Most of my career was spent focusing on anti-terrorism early in my career in the post 9/11 world and before that. And in recent years, it's been increasingly focused on school security, as well as also things like workplace violence and stuff like this. I have met many people that have been present during shooting events. I have friends that have been present in terrorist attacks. I have a few friends that have been killed in terrorist attacks. Myself personally, I have never actually been present when an attack event has occurred. And of all the events that I have been connected to in some way by interacting with people or working with organizations that have been attacked and whatnot, the one event of all that did have the potential to affect me at the deepest personal level occurred at the Strozer Library at Florida State University on the 20th of November, 2014. On this particular evening, shortly before midnight, a former alumnus of the university showed up at the Strozer Library carrying a handgun. And he walked inside of the library, opened fire on some people working inside that library, ended up shooting 2 people and was neutralized by police arriving on scene. And I say that that event had the potential to affect me at the deepest personal level because my second oldest daughter, Heather, had just exited the Strozer Library about 20 minutes before this attack occurred. She was actually residing just across the street in an apartment at the time. So just to kind of, put this whole risk discussion in perspective. Low probability events, potentially with high consequences. And there are things that our schools can do in order to responsibly mitigate these risks and that we can do as parents in order to help contribute to the safety of our schools. Now, circling back around to one of those questions I mentioned earlier, is my child's school safe? As a school security consultant, when I'm out there assessing schools, I am looking at all different types of issues. I'm looking at, from a comprehensive perspective, risk management measures, everything from their emergency response plans, preparations for threat assessments, policies and procedures, infrastructure like their emergency communication system, CCTV, access control, and then, of course, physical security of their buildings as well. Now, as a parent, you're not going to obviously have this kind of luxury in order to dig into your school's security at that kind of level, nor is it expected as a parent that you would have the knowledge, as it were, in order to effectively assess your school, in order to determine just how safe it is. But there are nevertheless some things that, if it helps you in better appreciating the safety of your school, that you can easily observe. These are by no means comprehensive in nature, but there's some basic indicators that can at least suggest to you whether or not you're in a very vulnerable school or a more prepared school. One of those things, first of all, is, are all doors other than the public lobby entrance locked at all times? This is the kind of thing I would expect to see in a safe and secure type school environment. But quite frequently, as a consultant working with different schools, I do not see. I find problems in this particular arena. If I witness this kind of condition, then that would be potential reason for concern. Does the school have a secured lobby? All schools should have some type of secure reception point in order to handle visitors, maybe you when you're in the process of picking up or signing your child out for a dentist appointment or something like that as well. Or can you just simply walk into the lobby and then continue into the occupied spaces of the school? This also would be an indicator as to the general level of readiness associated with that particular school. And then the next, are classrooms intrusion resistant and securely designed? In fact, myself as a parent, this is one of my key questions when my daughter, for instance, started her new middle school. Now, how can you tell that as a parent? Again, as a parent, you're not qualified, as it were, in order to effectively assess certain kinds of security vulnerabilities, but there are things that you can see visibly just simply visiting a school. First of all school classrooms should ideally be designed employing barriers that can effectively delay forcible entry. That would mean having a solid core wooden or steel type door. If I knock on that door when I'm going to visit, perhaps my child's teacher, and I can hear that it's hollow, that's not a good indicator. I'd be looking to hear a solid. Another question is, does it have a door handle that can be easily locked without the use of a key? And this relates to the door type that's used. And I'll discuss what I mean by that in just a moment. Windows ideally would be located away from windows in such a way that somebody could not just manipulate a door handle, and should also feature some type of shade or covering. And they should also ideally be intrusion resistant, meaning that they cannot be easily penetrated by somebody using impact force or firearm aided entry methods. And now, how can you tell that as a parent? I'll get to that in just 1 second here. Now, stepping back to this issue of the door locks, many schools that I assess, especially public schools, often employ what are referred to as classroom function locks, and that's represented on the image on the right-hand side of the screen. Classroom function locks require a key in order to lock the door from either the inside or the outside. These are problematic for a bunch of reasons. And because of the fact that we may have children on this call, I won't really give you a lot of detail about how these locks have contributed to tragedy in previous events. But I can just tell you that they are very problematic. And we have had a number of situations in the past where people have been unnecessarily harmed as a result of the fact that classrooms could not be easily and reliably locked under high stress conditions. And the way that I could recognize that as a parent, if I was entering into a classroom, is, do I see on both sides of the door handle that it requires a key to lock the door? If so, that's bad. What I want to see is something like an image on the left, where we have a button or a thumb turn on the inside of the lock that allows that teacher or perhaps students, if they're in that classroom at the time that an emergency occurs, so that they can adequately secure that lock without needing a key. Now, getting back to the issue or continuing that discussion for a moment, if they do have classroom function locks, which again is very common, that has been a standard that architects have used in school design for decades. One of my next questions as a parent would be, are they kept locked at all times in order to compensate for this kind of problem? Many schools, that is the way that they adapt to the situation. They keep those locks locked at all times. And then if that is the case, how do they manage students moving between classroom during periods, such as going to the restroom or maybe during class changes? On the slide right now, on the right-hand side, you see an example of a magnetic strip over a strike plate. That is one way that schools attempt to address this. So they keep the locks in a locked state, but the door can be easily secured just by pulling out this mag strip that would then allow the strike basically or the latch to engage the strike and thus keep the door locked. If I see this, typically when I see this as a consultant, I don't like these kinds of locks. I'm going to recommend that they change them eventually. That may require budget planning. But in the meantime, I at least want to make sure that those doors are kept in a locked state at all times. Now, as far as the glass on classrooms are concerned, the easiest way to tell whether or not the glass is intrusion resistant or not, safe glass on your classroom doors, is by simply looking in the corners of the windows themselves, and the door vision panels. And what a vision panel is basically just a window on the class door, which is very typical in school classroom doors. Now, if you look on the corner, as illustrated on the left-hand side, you'll usually see a stamp or a marking. If it says tempered, that's a problem. We don't like tempered glass for this purpose. Tempered glass does not provide much intrusion resistance against forcible entry, especially by somebody that's using a firearm maybe to aid entry. And you'll usually see a stamp there that says that tempered glass or ANSI Z97 or something like this. And by the way, that ANSI Z97 is just a standard for impact testing that's associated with tempered glass. What I would like to see is the word laminated. Laminated glass, I won't get into technical details, but it's just much more intrusion resistant than standard tempered glass. Now, a lot of schools that I assess as a consultant have wired glass vision panels, which is represented in the photograph on the lower right-hand side. These are better than tempered glass. They are more intrusion resistant, but they're not quite as intrusion resistant as laminated glass. Now, many schools in recent years having these kinds of windows, tempered glass windows, have upgraded them with the use of anti-shatter film. You probably wouldn't be able to recognize that just by looking at the window. But if the way I would address that if I was a parent was if I saw tempered glass, I would ask about it. I see that you got tempered glass here. Is this glass reinforced? And the answer, hopefully, is yes, that they are using anti-shatter film in order to prevent that glass breakage from just basically creating an open apertures where somebody can enter into a classroom. But again, that's something you're probably not going to be able to visually recognize just by looking at it. And if they have doors have vision panels like this, where they're narrower than 1.5 inches, well, in that case, I really don't care what kind of glass they have because they're narrow enough that somebody can't just reach inside and open up a door handle. This is a really good design, by the way. I like this kind of design. Now, what if we have a situation like this inside of our school? Well, that's a problematic situation. I usually discourage this type of thing whenever possible. At least in architectural design or in designing new schools and things like this. But if I had this kind of situation inside my child's school, where we have a lot of large open windows, especially full height windows or whatever, then it might, be justified to ask if you're concerned about security matters, what exactly the school has done in order to protect these windows or to provide safe refuge. Because if these are just standard tempered glass, those are not safe classrooms. And then another thing that you may be able to recognize pretty easily as a parent, another indicators that we're of a safe school, is do they have a responder on site that can be easily and quickly deployed rapidly in order to intercept or interdict any kind of threat that there happens to be on campus. So that's usually in public schools going to be a school resource officer. In some school districts today, many independent schools, that may be an armed security officer. If it is an armed security officer, what does their level of competency seem to be? Is it somebody that was hired from the lowest bidder, as it were, or do they seem like somebody maybe former law enforcement, former military, somebody that seems like they have a level of tactical capability, but also integrates well within the school community? That's the kind of thing I like to see when I talk about armed security personnel. Now, again, there's a whole lot of other things that may be under the hood of the cars, or that may not be obvious just looking at it, as these 4 simple points that would suggest that we have a safe school or not. But these are 4 easily recognized indicators by you as a parent that you have a safe school or you have potentially larger problems in your school. Now, what about campus fencing? I get asked about this question a lot. There's a lot of misunderstandings about where campus fencing is valuable or how it may be valuable. And a lot of parents, and I bring this up in this presentation because a lot of parents are often under this impression that if my school does not have fencing, it is not a safe school, or that would be an expectation of some sort. Truthfully, when I work with schools as a consultant, whether or not I advise the use of fencing really depends on certain conditions. From a cost benefit perspective, it sometimes makes sense. and other times it does not. It really depends on factors like geography and other things like this. A good example, if we were to have maybe a small school, like this example here on slide is an example of a medium-sized middle school. All the buildings here are relatively closely located, just walkways in between these different buildings and small grassy areas. Simply enclosing those buildings with the use of fencing with appropriate gates in order to facilitate egress during emergencies and secure entry points creates what we would call a contiguous protective layer. In other words, one layer, think of it as being like a chain without any broken links around the outside of the actual confines of those school buildings. So in this case, as a consultant, I would say fencing makes sense. Invest the money. On the other hand, in this example, where we have a large K-12 independent school with a very large perimeter around the outside that can't be effectively monitored, meaning that if somebody climbed it, nobody's going to detect an intrusion into that campus. So we have this very large area. And in this case, we also have two public roads entering into the campus, which would require entry control points in order to screen people that are driving into the campus. That's a very large amount of area, large amount of space in order to cover. And in that particular case, if I was working with that client, I'd probably advise against it. I would rather see that particular school probably spend their money more wisely on other protective measures that are going to give a much better performance when these types of events occur. Any barrier, fencing, other whatever, quite often when I ask people, what is the purpose of a fence around the outside of a school? Their response is, it prevents people from coming in. No, fences don't prevent anybody from doing anything. All fences do is they define the property boundary. They discourage non-committed criminal trespass against committed people, those people that want to cause harm. They only delay somebody from coming in. That's it. And if they are not accompanied by detection, meaning that we don't know that somebody's coming into the school, then they really provide no value at all. So the moral of this little part of the story is, don't judge your school based on whether or not they have a fence. It's these other measures that I'm mentioning that are probably better and reliable indicators of whether or not you have a safe school. Now, what about metal detectors and X-ray machines? I get asked about this quite frequently by people. Well, this kind of reverts back in a very similar type of way. From a cost-benefit perspective, X-ray machines and metal detectors often don't make sense in a lot of school environments. They're not a magic solution to the issue of active shooter violence inside of schools, and in many cases can actually have a detrimental impact. The National Association of School Psychologists wrote a position paper, well supported by research, back in 2014, discouraging the use of high-profile security measures in schools due to their detrimental impact on school climate and culture. And as a security consultant, I read that from cover to cover, and I agree with 98% of the points that NASP made in there. If you make a school look like a prison and feel like a prison, don't be surprised when the people going to school there feel like inmates. And that's a big problem with the way that school security is being implemented in a lot of areas today. I am a strong advocate of employing security measures in a way that are largely unnoticed by students. Invisible layers, as it were, of protection and emergency preparedness. Now, in urban areas where there's been a high rate of general gun crime or gangs and things like this, then yeah, the probability of kids bringing guns to school may warrant those kinds of measures. But for the average school in the United States and the average independent school for that matter, it just does not make sense from a cost benefit perspective. And in many cases can actually contribute to other kinds of problems. As I mentioned before, this whole issue of climate and culture that's kind of satirized and, as it were, by this cartoon on slide right now. Now, before we move on to the next subject, what can I do about it? Let's just say that, okay, my kid's classroom is not safe. They don't have any kind of secure lobby in the front. The doors are unlocked, and they don't have a school resource officer or anybody like this. Craig's little 4 indicators of whether or not my school might be safe are not, answered correctly, as it were. Well, it really kind of depends. If you're an independent school parent, Well, the fact that you're paying tuition every single year and to that school gives you a voice. So maybe it's time to speak with the headmaster or somebody else inside of that school and express your concerns. And maybe if necessary, get together with some other parents. Now, quite often, voices in groups tend to be heard very well in independent schools. In the public school world, it's a little bit more challenging because obviously we don't have that kind of influence over the school in order to make certain kinds of improvements. But at least it gives you the basis to bring something to somebody's attention. Now, bear in mind, these kinds of events that we're talking about just do not happen in a vacuum. When it comes to an outsider causing harm inside of a school, somebody like Salvador Ramos, like we witnessed down in Uvalde, or Adam Lanza up at Sandy Hook Elementary. These individuals are not students within the school, and unless law enforcement became aware of their planning and preparation for an attack, probably would not have been able to have stopped something like that, at least not at the school level, as far as preemptively, proactively stopping it in advance. But the vast majority of these kinds of events are examples of what we call targeted violence. And targeted violence is preceded by a process of ideation, planning, and preparation. These events just don't happen overnight. Contrary to what the old term that a lot of people used to use was he snapped. Well, truthfully, that's all a myth. These types of events do not happen with somebody snapping. This is somebody that has been thinking about this for a while. And they progress along what psychologists call a pathway to targeted violence. And along that pathway, there's often certain behaviors that they may engage in that often can be observable and serve as indicators, warnings that an individual may be progressing towards violence. And that's actually illustrated in this diagram on screen right here, where we have people moving from the violent fantasy phase into realization fantasies until they've actually committed to an act of violence, at which point they enter into a preparation phase, then the final decision and the execution of the violence itself. And on the right-hand side of this little pyramid, we see various different examples of the kinds of behaviors that may be visible to somebody that happens to be watching. And there happens to be a lot of research in this arena over the last 30 years, trying to figure out what kinds of behaviors would have been evident, visible to teachers, to administrators, to parents, and even other students. And the FBI actually just published recently a report on this matter. And there's actually been preceding reports by the FBI and the U.S. Secret Service on this as well. And what they found was that among these different events, looking at juvenile age perpetrators, 92% of these events, there were warning behaviors that were recognized by other schoolmates. And in 75% of incidents, there were warning behaviors that were recognized by teachers and school staff. And 68% of these events were recognized by family members as well. However, unfortunately, quite frequently, these types of behaviors don't get reported in a way that they can effectively result in some type of investigation and proactive action in order to prevent violence from happening before it does. So as a parent, you can serve a very important role in preventing violence in your school by being aware of warning behaviors and being attentive to things that your child may report to you as being a potential issue of danger. We've had a number of school shooting incidents that were prevented as a result of a tip from a parent to the authorities that thus resulted in an investigation that ultimately revealed a student that was planning a school attack. One good example is right here in Tampa. And back in 2011, we had an incident that was planned by a high school student by the name of Jared Kano. He'd actually been expelled from school and spent the summer planning a school shooting and was planning on opening up the brand new school year with this attack. And Kano tried recruiting a friend of his to participate in it. And his friend was kind of creeped out by this situation, was disturbed, and reported it to his mother. Initially, Kano's mother didn't, or excuse me, my apologies, not Kano, the other kid. This kid's mother did not take it seriously. She just kind of dismissed it. And it was only after Kano circled back on his friend again that this friend went to his mom again and said, "Hey, Mom, this is serious." And she eventually then picked up the phone and called Tampa police. fortunately, because that investigation then revealed a lot of other behaviors, strongly indicating that this was a very serious threat. Now, in the aftermath of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting here in Florida, the state of Florida created a centralized hotline or reporting method, we'll say, for this kind of information, these kinds of tips. And it's facilitated through a website, which is getfortifyflorida.com, getfortifyfl.com. And they actually have a little app that you can download on your phone, and you can submit tips like this, or you can even do it through their web portal too, for that matter. Many schools also have an anonymous reporting system for this kind of purpose. A lot of my clients are independent schools, and in their case, they're not necessarily plugged into the getfortifyflorida.com system, but they do have their own independent anonymous reporting methods nevertheless. Now, a lot of these kinds of warning behaviors that we often see, or that kids recognize in many cases, or that parents may become aware of, come in with the form of what's called leakage. This is a term in the world of psychology, threat assessment, for any situation where a person expresses violent intent to a third party, usually not to the target, not to the victim themselves, but to somebody else. This could be in the form of social media. This could be in the form of, like Jared Kano, talking to his friend, telling him what he's planning on doing. It could be done in a very direct type of manner. It could be done in a veiled way, implying that violence is going to happen, like saying, stay away from school on Friday, or wait till you get to see what's coming up next, things like this. And there's been a number of studies looking at the presence of this kind of behavior preceding attacks. And according to the Secret Service, looking at data that they published back in the early 2000s, in 81% of incidents involving student perpetrators, at least one person, usually another student, had information that an attacker was thinking about or planning an attack. And in almost 60% of those incidents, more than one person had information about that, meaning that the student that was planning this event or thinking about it, fantasizing about it, had communicated this to somebody else. And in a different study done by Jens Hoffman, another researcher in this area, 100% of the actual school shooters that he had studied had displayed this type of warning behavior as well. Now, let me make a little point here real quick about leakage, this type of expressing to somebody else about intent to commit violence. A lot of individuals who are not necessarily planning actual school attacks also will exhibit leakage warning behavior too, what we might call the threateners versus the actual ones that are going to do it. So leakage alone does not necessarily tell us that we have a threat, but it does tell us we have a situation that needs to be reported and investigated, because it is very universal with those who actually do this type of thing. So now, taking this back into my perspective as a parent, any type of behavior where somebody has expressed violent intent towards others, especially if it's accompanied by any kind of discussion about planning or preparation, if somebody starts getting specific or communicates something specific in any way, that definitely is a potential indicator of threat. In fact, that may be an example of another kind of warning behavior called pathway warning behavior, which is evidence of planning and preparation for an attack. And this could come in the form of any kind of communication about violent interest through social media posts, drawings, and other forms of creative expression, in addition to just verbal comments that are made. If a student who happens to be discovered in possession or attempting to acquire weapons or bomb-making materials, this is an example of what I mentioned a moment ago called pathway warning behavior, evidence of planning and preparation for an attack, and any evidence suggesting potential violent intent regarding the school itself or specific students. So if I, as a parent, become aware of any of these kinds of behaviors, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a dangerous situation, but these are the kinds of behaviors we often may recognize before something happens and should be reported to at least initiate a proper investigation and what's called a threat assessment. So what does the school do when they receive these kinds of reports, and law enforcement too, for that matter? Well, I'll put law enforcement aside out of this discussion because the way that law enforcement is going to respond does vary a bit from location to location, from state to state, for instance. But universally, the practice is that it's going to initiate what's called a threat assessment. Threat assessment is a systematic and evidence-based approach to gathering details about an individual of concern's behavior, and then trying to determine whether or not there's a potential for violence, a risk of violence. And there's a tremendous amount of research that underlies the different threat assessment methodologies and models that are out there today. In the state of Florida, after the MSDHS high school shooting, we adopted in the state the comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines. It's called the CSTAG model for conducting threat assessments. So all the local schools throughout the state of Florida have been training up threat assessment teams for this kind of purpose using this particular model. In the independent school world and in other states, if there's anybody from Guidewell joining us from elsewhere, it may vary. There's other models out there too, like the Salem-Kaiser model is very popular in a lot of other parts of the country. Now, although the methodology they may use is a little bit different, they all have the same aim, same goal, and typically involve a similar process, which is basically going to involve collecting information about the threat, interviewing the student after they've already interviewed witnesses, parents of the student, looked on social media and all these other various different kinds of investigative activities, and then trying to determine whether or not there's evidence that this student is progressing toward potential violence. And they will make decisions at certain points along the way, in some cases influenced by the behavior of the student. A lot of the threats that occur out there are misunderstandings. And I can tell you that also from my own personal experience, having participated in many threat assessments. And that can often be resolved relatively quickly just through some initial investigation. And what we're looking for in many cases are certain kinds of indicators to be present, certain kinds of behaviors, but that cannot be effectively remedied just by simply talking with the student to ascertain what their purpose was. Why did you make that statement, to a particular child, for instance, or post something on social media? And what we're essentially trying to do is discern what might be targeted aggression versus what's often called effective aggression. And the reason why I added this slide to my presentation is because there's a lot of confusion on this matter by people about what constitutes genuine, dangerous threat behavior. Somebody that's progressing towards an act of mass violence versus, what is a student just maybe making a direct threat inside of a class while they're angry, that kind of thing. A lot of the behavior that we end up looking at in threat assessments does turn out to be effective aggression, which is usually just an expression of emotional, sometimes defensive aggression, anger. Generally, there's no premeditation involved, and effective aggression is often spontaneous and temporary and usually non-lethal. And a lot of other threat assessments that we engage in turns out to be misunderstandings, things that, just a good example of this kind of thing. I had a case that I got brought into, a threat assessment case, where, a couple of kids were in the back of the room or whatever, playing on a phone or whatever, and they played the siren to the movie The Purge, and it creeped out a couple of other kids, and they made an initial report. And then we got brought in, to basically aid with a threat assessment. Well, it turns out in the end of the day, that wasn't a threat at all. That was just a couple of kids that were just playing around in the back of a room. And a lot of the threat assessments I get involved in are like this. Another one I got involved in was a kid that made a threatening statement on social media to a girl inside of the school that he felt had done her wrong. And he made a couple of other statements too that were really kind of more aimed at drawing attention to himself. They were an expression of anger and frustration at her, and then also seeking sympathy from her as well too. On surface, that wasn't evident. It did require a little bit of investigation and interview and things like this for us to effectively resolve that. And sure enough, the kid was not a danger. He's actually a pretty good kid. He was just going through a rough time. And that brings me to another point too, is that quite frequently when we do these threat assessments and they turn out to be benign circumstances, or what the terminology is called a transient threat situation, they often reveal kids who need help, somebody that's got problems in their life. And so almost always the results of the threat assessment process usually have some kind of positive outcome. Even if we don't necessarily stop a shooting event, many cases, we've identified a kid who has issues in their life that needs some navigation, needs some support. Now, it is not uncommon that when a concern does arise about a particular student, rumors will often spread throughout the school community, especially among parents, that there's a threat assessment underway, that a particular student has been identified as a potential concern, and that the school is in the process of assessing the situation. Maybe law enforcement's been involved or maybe not in some cases. And I bring this up for a reason, because I have witnessed this in several threat assessments in the past, where now we've got a whole bunch of concerned parents inside of the school, what I like to call the parent mob at this point, that have torches and pitchforks standing on the the headmaster or the principal's doorstep, wanting to know what's being done in order to protect their school, or why this kid isn't in jail yet, that kind of thing. And this happens frequently, especially, in communities where everybody kind of knows everybody else, which is often, I see this a lot in independent schools, but it happens in public schools too. Please don't join the parent mob. When a school is conducting a threat assessment or law enforcement is investigating a situation like this, as I mentioned a minute ago, the overwhelming majority of these turn out to be innocent when they're actually investigated. Again, sometimes we have a kid who needs help, but not necessarily a kid that's progressing towards violence. Hence, that's the whole reason why we have a threat assessment process, to try to distinguish the difference in these circumstances. But a lot of scared, panicked, and in some cases, angry parents, that really isn't going to contribute anything to the situation at all, except just, create a lot of frustration, a lot of distraction from the process that's actually going on at that point. Now, I realize as a parent, when we hear that something like this is going on inside of our school, we're naturally going to be concerned. We're naturally going to be afraid. And if the school wasn't doing anything about it, if they weren't conducting a threat assessment, then I might, have strong reason to be concerned. But in many of these cases, if they are investigating it and it's being handled, allow that process to take place. Allow them to do what they need to do, because that's exactly what should be occurring at this point. And again, try not to create problems in the process by getting overtly panicked about this type of thing. And I only bring this matter up specifically because I've observed it in a bunch of cases in the past. Now, let me circle back around on a point I made a few minutes ago. 68% of the incidents that the FBI recognized when they investigated these cases, family members were aware of threatening behavior. However, when we look at actual cases where we had people that were on the pathway to targeted violence, students that were on the pathway to targeted violence, the overwhelming majority of those cases were not initiated by reports from family members, but were other students, faculty members, or other adults that became aware of it because of maybe their children or other students. And part of that is because a lot of parents of kids that are on the pathway to target violence have a natural state of denial about it. They reject the possibility that their child could be potentially a killer. And I've seen this a bunch of times in the past. And unfortunately, we have tons of cases to support this statement that I'm making right now. There's a guy by the name of Phil Chalmers who has researched over the years juvenile perpetrators of violence. He's written a couple books, like Inside the Mind of a Teen Killer is one of them. And in that book, he actually has an entire chapter called How to Raise a Teen Killer. And he breaks down all these different kinds of behaviors, family circumstances in many cases, that contribute to teens engaging in violent behavior and sometimes mass violence. Now, in the world of threat assessment, we often call these kinds of circumstances or conditions what are called risk, factors. But a lot of parents are so focused on very specific issues that they consider important that they don't see a lot of these other things going on in the background. And that's kind of, satirized by the cartoon on screen right now. We have mom inside of the room who's more worried about the cigarettes that she found inside of his jeans, than the fact that he's, obsessively immersed in violence and, fascinated with previous mass killers. In fact, it is shocking when we look from an investigative perspective how often there are big breadcrumbs laying all over the place, warning us about this, that go unnoticed by parents. Now, some of these risk factors include things like having motive. The universal motive in many of these types of school shooting events are revenge, grievance, history of traumatic experience, personal losses, drug and alcohol abuse, violence immersion or preoccupation with violence, depression, suicidality, absence of coping skills, anger management problems, sensation seeking, psychotic traits, abuse of home life, social or family conflict, lack of reliable supervision, marginalized social status with ongoing conflicts, lack of peer connection and harmful collaboration or peer pressure, and easy access to or fascination with deadly weapons. These are, according to the research out there, universal characteristic. Let me not say that not everybody has all of these factors, but these are factors that are directly correlated with a lot of these kinds of events. Now, obviously, there's a lot of kids out there, probably maybe even our own kids, that have some of these risk factors in their lives, which is why these risk factors alone don't tell us that we have a dangerous child or a dangerous situation. We also look at what are referred to as stabilizing factors. And these are factors that help create a sense of stability in a child's life, including things like having pro-social friends and peer support, stable family environment, a sense of spirituality, coping skills and emotional resilience, and their involvement, things like sports, extracurricular activities, peer respect, and even things like having pets are all considered contributing factors to stabilizing this situation or that this environment that this child lives within. What we don't like to see when we're doing threat assessments is a situation like this, where the risk factors far outweigh the stabilizing factors. Now, it is quite possible that somebody on this call knows a kid who's in a situation like this. If that is the case, that doesn't mean that that kid is a violent threat. What it means is this kid needs help, for sure. Now, if we're conducting a threat assessment in response to other stuff, warning behaviors, and we see these kinds of risk factors, then that kind of amplifies our concern about the situation. And our response in most cases is going to be to try to improve stabilizing factors. So even though I know many people that are on this call right now are listening to this discussion, thinking about maybe their kids' friends or the kid who lives next door, bear in mind, if this is your child by chance, then maybe this is something to take a look at. Because again, in a very large number of these types of events, parents are in a state of denial and don't recognize the situation that might be incubating right underneath their nose. Now, if we have a concern about our own child in this respect, report it to somebody, please. I know that may create a situation of inconvenience or potential embarrassment, but it is much better in order to get some help in intervening and assessing the situation than just to keep it quietly to oneself. Even in the Jared Kano case I mentioned earlier, his grandfather even asked him, "Are you planning to do a Columbine?" He saw that there was something wrong in this situation, and it never got reported to the authorities. It had to come from another kid's mother. You can also conduct a search of your child's room or is their computer as well. We almost always find breadcrumbs. Things like, weapons and ammunition, drawings, notes of an explicitly violent nature, unusual notes regarding school activities, things like this. Images and videos of an explicitly violent nature. Violence immersion is almost a universal characteristic of a lot of students on this pathway to targeted violence. Fascination with previous violence, etc. Because there may be kids on this call, I won't go into depth about some of the kinds of stuff that we find when we investigate this. I will just say that Adam Lanza, for instance, who was executed the Sandy Hook elementary shooting, there was stuff on his computer that would have probably given Freddy Krueger nightmares. I mean, there was a very, very disturbing stuff that to a parent should definitely have been a warning that there was something wrong that needed to be addressed. Now, next, in addition to recognizing and reporting a behavior of concern, know your school's reunification plan. Anytime there's a major event on a school, there's going to probably be students moved to another location for reunification with you as a parent. This is often going to be a place like a community center, maybe another school or a church. So make sure that you know where that location is. So if you ever get a call letting you know that maybe there was a bomb threat at the school or maybe some other kind of emergency, it doesn't have to be necessarily like an active shooter attack. Any kind, there's a major event on campus, this reunification plan goes into effect. Also, make sure that you keep your contact information updated with your school. So if they do need to enact a reunification plan of some type, you're prepared, or they can get a hold of you for that matter. Now, because of time, I'm not going to walk through this whole reunification process in depth. I'm going to skip over some slides, but I just want to kind of emphasize some expectations. When you arrive at a reunification site for reunification, you're going to need to have an ID. What's going to happen is this is an orderly process of reunifying kids with their parents and documenting that reunification. So usually they're going to have a greeting area set up. You're going to arrive at that greeting area. They're going to hand you a card. They're going to check your ID, and they're going to ask you to fill that card out with your child's name and information, all that kind of stuff. And if they design their reunification well, you're not even going to be able to see your children. They're going to be inside of an auditorium somewhere, inside of a gymnasium or somewhere else. And that's done for a reason, by the way. And that's because parents have a tendency to get very impatient and frustrated if they can see that their kid is sitting in a courtyard right over there, and they just want to pick their child up and go home. Reunification is done like this for a reason, and that's to make sure that we have a proper counting of all children and that everybody that's released is being released to somebody appropriately. I realize that may be frustrating, and I realize that may be take time in many cases, but that's what's required in order to do this effectively and in a responsible way as a school. So just kind of expect, that will be the case when you arrive on site for any kind of school reunification purpose.